What's going on, everyone? I'm back, and today I wanted to look at a really interesting player comparison, and that of two teammates, Jarvis Landry versus Josh Gordon of the Cleveland Browns. And look, this has been a really interesting topic, one that I've been getting a lot of questions about, and also one that I've been facing a lot in my own personal drafts. Now, the big question obviously is who's going to be the number one wide receiver on that offense? Are they both viable number one receivers? Well, the good news is I've got all the stats and rankings needed to answer precisely those questions, so let's get right into it. So for me personally, whenever it comes to grading out a player in fantasy, there's typically two things I always look at. First, the average draft position of that player in PPR and standard formats both. And in order to get a better picture, I try and go ahead compare this data across several different platforms. For example, today we'll be looking at ESPN, Yahoo, and NFL's rankings. And I actually think this will be pretty useful because these are probably the three most popular platforms we all use to go and draft our teams. On top of this, the second thing I always obviously look at is the performances from years back in terms of the statistics. Now, again, other than the numbers that were put up, that's very nice, but to me it comes down to patterns. And can you go ahead and see some kind of pattern when it comes to regression or maybe bettering in play? Because the big question is, was this a fluke? And if so, why? If you can answer that question, that is a big help. On top of this, there are a couple of other factors that I usually consider, but since both of these players are on the same team and on the same positional group, they won't hold as much weight, but regardless, I will go ahead and briefly mention them. First is the play of the quarterback. But since both these players are going to be on the same offense and they're going to have the same guy throwing them the football, whether it's Baker Mayfield or Tyrod Taylor, like I said, not that big of a factor. I will go ahead and preface this in saying, however, I do think the ceiling of both of these players is higher if Tyrod Taylor is in that offense. But again, since he's going to go ahead and impact both of these guys positively, not something to worry about too much. The final thing I do try and look at is the schedule of these players and the defenses that they will go up against. But since both of them are going to be on the same offense, the defense is not going to be that big of a factor. They're going to be going up against the same, whether it's a stout or weak defense, week in and week out. Kicking things off with a look at our different platform rankings, which again have been updated here about a day or two ago each. We have ESPN at the top with our PPR format, Landry coming in at 49th, Gordon at 40th. Then in standard, Gordon 35th, Landry 52nd. In Yahoo, in PPR, Landry 32nd, Gordon 39th. And then in standard, Gordon 43rd, Landry 86th. And finally in NFL, a little bit wacky here because our wide receiver PPR format rankings are wide receiver based, not overall player based. So Landry 14th, wide receiver overall, Gordon 22nd. And then in standard, Gordon 42nd overall player, Landry 47th overall player. So a lot of information, but what does it all mean? And in reality, what should be the proper ADPs for both of these guys? Well, before I let you guys know that information, let's kind of deep dive this because a lot to process, and there's a couple things that stand out to me, starting with the PPR rankings. And the biggest outlier to me here, obviously, is that ESPN is the only one of these platforms that has Landry ranked below Josh Gordon. And I think that's absolutely ludicrous. That shouldn't be the case because when it's all said and done, Landry, in all of his years, pretty much since he entered the league, compared to Josh Gordon's best year, has bettered him in terms of, receptions per year. Obviously, a little bit tough to compare because of the amount of time Josh Gordon has missed. But regardless, when you are the type of caliber player Landry is and the amount of receptions he gets specifically because he is that slot guy, he should be above Josh Gordon. Now the question is, how much above him? Well, to me, I'd probably say in the grand scheme of things, in PPR, I see Jarvis Landry as a top 15 wide receiver. And I'd say that most closely reflects what Yahoo has here, where Landry is the 32nd overall best player, Josh Gordon the 39th. So round-wise, I'd say in PPR, I'd be drafting these guys towards the end of the third round, probably early fourth round. And now shifting our attention to standard rankings. Well, here I will say I do think Josh Gordon should be a little bit higher just because he has a little bit more touchdown potential, being that more physical wide receiver. And a guy that'll probably get some more targets in the red zone. So to me, probably 4 or 5 spots, similar to what ESPN has, is something I would agree with for Josh Gordon. Then the big outlier here and the big question is, how much of a drop should Landry expect when going from PPR to standard, because there is a drop. Now, obviously, I would say it is not what Yahoo has, because having him drop from 32nd to 86th overall is absolutely insane. That's a difference of between 4 and 5 rounds depending the league you're in. And I would say, I will go ahead and drop him probably by about a round, maybe 2, but I do think probably the perfect spot is about a round and a half compared to Josh Gordon. So I will say Josh Gordon in a standard format, I do prefer him. He has a bigger ceiling, which is something that I find attractive. And if you haven't gone that wide receiver 1, Josh Gordon can be, I believe, in standard formats, wide receiver 1 potential. Obviously, the big concern here is, will Josh Gordon play all 16 games? Well, as of right now, he's active, and I'm treating that, obviously barring any injuries, that both these guys playing 16 games. So again, to recap, in PPR, I see Landry as a top 15 guy. I think you should be drafting him at the end of the 3rd round, early 4th round if he's still available there. Honestly, I might draft him a little bit earlier since I'm really high on him. But again, at that point in time, very good value in my opinion for Jarvis Landry. And then Josh Gordon, probably, 4 or 5 picks afterwards, something that I would expect. And then when it comes to standard, Josh Gordon, probably, late 3rd round, early 4th round, while Jarvis Landry would go ahead, drop to end of the 4th round, early 5th round. So now looking at our statistics from the last couple of years. When it comes to Jarvis Landry and his stats, the first thing that sticks out are the gaudy numbers for receptions and targets. Last year, 161 targets, 112 receptions. Year before that, 131 targets, 94 receptions, and before that, 166 targets and 110 receptions. In terms of yardage, maybe you're worried, okay, last year he didn't have 1,000 yards, 987 versus almost 1,200 yards the years before that. I would say that I think you can go ahead, relax a little bit. That does have something to do with the Jay Cutler effect. Cutler was also injured at certain points in the season, so keep all of those things in mind. That chemistry was never really there for Landry, yet he was still able to get a career high in touchdowns. So he does still show you there when he didn't exactly have the yardage situation going for him, he can put together a high touchdown performance. He has that in him. If I had to go ahead and give you guys my prediction for those categories, based on these 3-year averages, reception-wise, I think it's pretty easy to say he's going to get you somewhere between 95 to 105 receptions for the year. The only thing bringing down that average is those 94 receptions. But the good news is he was still almost able to match his career high in yards from the year before. Target-wise, again, between 140 to 145, maybe even 150 targets by the end of the year when it's all said and done. And yardage-wise, since the last 2 out of the 3 years, again, almost 1,200 yards. I'm going to go ahead and say again, about 1,200 yards this year. Touchdown-wise, I will, however, be a little bit conservative between, 4 to 6 touchdowns for Jarvis Landry. He's not that big red zone threat. Now, if you look at those fantasy points all the way to the right, those are in a standard format. When you go ahead and add pretty much 100 extra points in PPR formats, you get to about 250, maybe 260 points at the end of the year. And that is, without a doubt, in my eyes, top 15 wide receiver numbers. And it shows you why he's so valuable in those PPR leagues. Now, shifting our attention to Josh Gordon. Last year, obviously didn't play the entire year. That Browns team wasn't exactly good at the quarterback position. And a lot of the targets he saw were honestly unable to be caught. So he doesn't deserve that much blame with that pedestrian stat line of 18 receptions for 335 yards and 1 touchdown. But let's look at 2013 because that's what a lot of people are basing Josh Gordon's potential performance on this year. Because that was the year in 14 games he had 87 receptions, 1,646 yards, and 9 touchdowns. Now, I think it's pretty obvious if, and that's a big if, and to me an unrealistic if, Josh Gordon puts together the same numbers, he's going to be wide receiver number 1, which he was in 2013 when he put together that stat line. Because again, in standard formats, he put together 227 points that year. If you add the PPR numbers with about 90 extra points, that puts you as wide receiver number 1 compared to what Antonio Brown and DeAndre Hopkins did. But unfortunately, by definition, that year was an outlier. So I do have to be more conservative with my prediction when it comes to Josh Gordon and what he's going to be able to do this year. Yardage-wise, I think you're looking between 1,200 and 1,300 yards, and I think that's being generous. Receptions, I'm going to go ahead and say between 80 and 90 receptions. And touchdowns, I'll probably say between 5 to 7, 6 to 8 touchdowns. And again, I think that's being generous. And since so much of this, we have to kind of presume what Josh Gordon is, what in my eyes makes him a riskier option. To me, Jarvis Landry is the much safer option when it comes to PPR and why I think he should be going earlier. And on the flip side, Josh Gordon in standard leagues, I think should be going earlier than Jarvis Landry. Now, the big question here, however, is do we think both of these guys can be as good as where they are being drafted, which at certain points in time is top 15 wide receivers? Well, if we look at the NFL these last couple of years, last year, there was only one team that had 2 top 15 wide receivers in PPR scoring. That was the Lions with Marvin Jones and Golden Tate. The year before that in PPR, it was the Raiders and the Packers. So what's the takeaway here? Well, for me, the big thing is you don't necessarily have to be a playoff team, which the Lions weren't last year, to have 2 top 15 wide receivers. And I think that's good news for the Browns because I don't see them making it to the playoffs, but I can still see Gordon and Landry putting together very respectable stat lines. And in PPR, for sure, predict a top 15 performance from both these guys. It's not out of the realm of possibility. And standard, I'm going to go ahead and say Josh Gordon has the better chance of finishing top 15. And Jarvis Landry right around probably 18th or 19th ranked wide receiver. So after all of that, the big question that still has to be answered is who is the more valuable guy? Is it Jarvis Landry or Josh Gordon? To me, you have to look at both ADP and projected statistics for 2018, which we did. We looked at who to target in PPR versus standard formats, where to target them round-wise, and who to pick first. We made projections for 2018 based on previous years. And after all of that, I believe truly the guy that is more valuable with those factors combined is without a doubt Jarvis Landry. And the reason I say that, PPR wise, I think he's a much safer choice. But the overarching theme of all of this is all those exercises we did with Josh Gordon. There's a reason why people are scared to go ahead and invest a 3rd round pick in Gordon, because everything we're doing here is from speculation of one big year in 2013. We still have to see Josh Gordon reproduce that. I'm going to go ahead and go with the safer choice. Jarvis Landry is that. In PPR leagues, we've seen he can finish as a top 15 wide receiver. You can get him for better value, not only in PPR leagues, but also in standard leagues. Okay, he finishes outside the top 15 in standard, but what's it going to be by? 1 wide receiver, 2, 3 wide receivers? But in certain leagues, you can go ahead and get him a whole 2 rounds later or 3 rounds later in those scenarios. And honestly, sign me up for that all day long. Now, as always, let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with this? Are you a team Jarvis Landry or team Josh Gordon? And why? Where would you go ahead and draft these guys? How would you value them in each type of format? And as always, if you guys have any other related fantasy questions, go ahead, let me hear it in the comments section. And if you enjoyed, make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos.